This is going to be my notes thing I do now for studying because I feel like speaking out loud will help me memorize. And also, if anything, I can just listen back to this before the test. So yeah, that's cool. I don't know. This will probably be really long, but I'll pause. Doesn't matter. I'm wasting too much data with this now. Okay. Starting with salutary neglect. Right? The end of the French and Indian Civil War, 7 Years' War, has an impact on England and her colonies on the eastern seaboard. England wins the war and picks up all the territory out to the Mississippi River, Canada, and Florida. The British Empire in North America becomes enormous. With this new territory, there are more Englishmen in the New World. The colonial elite want to sell it, but England says it's theirs to sell. Big bucks for England. England spends a lot of money to send troops and surveyors to the territory and provisional governors too. She spends money on Canada too. England is already in debt. She carried 70 million pounds of debt before the war started. By the time the war ends, it rose to 140 million pounds of debt. The debt isn't due anytime soon, but it's still big, and they're about to spend a bunch more money on the new territories. Britain hasn't been making a ton of money in America. She makes money off trade. But what if we tax them on other things? 1763, they began taxing the colonists. They were taxed at a lower rate than people in English, which was 26% higher than people in the colonies. Britain wasn't very happy with the colonists because they caused the war. This war is the first time the colonists worked together. People start interacting with the other people in different colonies. With the defeat of France, the enemy is gone. The colonies were dependent on Britain for protection against the French, but now they are gone. The colonists start getting a sense of why are there more British troops coming in? Why Britain here? Britain is going to stop salutary neglect on the colonies as long as they only traded with Britain and didn't do anything to anyone else. They didn't pay much attention to the colonies. After 1763, Britain started cracking down on the colonies. This is especially hard for the colonial elites because they aren't used to Britain doing things to them. The problem with all these laws is they punish everybody unjustly. Parliament passes a fifth law called the Quebec Act 1776. It says all the territory out west that the British picked up from the war is not part of the American colonies anymore. It would go to Canada. It would continue to be a military district. If they decide to settle the territory, there will be no representative government at all. This scared the colonists. Colonial leaders thought they were next for no representative government. They called a meeting for representatives from all 13 colonies to talk about the acts and how they should respond. The meeting will be held in Philadelphia. 12 of the 13 colonies send representatives, and it's known as the First Continental Congress, September 1774, Philadelphia. Georgia doesn't send any because they are still setting up their colony. What should we do? They have two ideas. They write a letter to the king saying you may not be aware of what Parliament is doing in his name. They will ask for him to work with them to get Parliament to overturn the acts. They also ask for support towards salutary neglect. They never get a response from the king. The other thing they do is they tell the colonies to get weapons, ammunitions, and other things like that. They should start training and getting ready. They say that it's possible that there could be a war with England. Consider battle plans and prepare to defend yourself. They ask merchants to try to not sell to Britain. They say all this to the king. They didn't necessarily want to leave the empire. The final thing they say is to wait a while to work, so that they will come back together in the spring of 1775. In between the two meetings, war breaks out accidentally. Whoopsie daisies. The Stamp Act was the first act to be passed by the British to help repay their debts to the war that they did. That was passed in 1765. Now I'm going to talk about the Sons of Liberty in my notes. 1773. The British think that things are going well, so in the spring they pass a Tea Act. This lowers the tax on tea. The most important tea exporter was the British East India Company, private, public company with private investor, and the government owns a chunk. The BEIC is wealthy and powerful. The tea harvest was bad that year, so there wasn't much tea. And what they had was bad tea leaves. How do they make money now? What about the colonists? They don't get tea because they were poor, and the government at Britain was like, you guys suck. So I guess they get bad tea because of it. Which, great logic there, I guess. I don't know. They can also sell it for cheaper because it makes the poor people feel rich. The first shipments start coming in the fall. People start buying it and they think it's horrible. Most don't buy it anymore. So British sends more instead of taking it back. By October and November, warehouses are getting full. The warehouses stay full, but they keep sending more, but there's nowhere to put them. The British are going to stay there until they unload the tea, but the colonists don't want it. In Boston, the Sons of Liberty say, okay, fine. The Sons of Liberty are a group of people that are trying to rebel against the British Empire. I don't know why I don't say this a lot, but whatever. So one night on the 16th of December, 1773, Sam Adams was making a plot that would happen tonight. They wanted a night where sailors would mostly all leave, but gather the Sons of Liberty. Some of the wives bundle up the children and follow the husbands. In the bag that the dads take with them was makeup and womanly stuff, a hatchet. You disguise as Indians and attack the ships. The soldiers are thrown overboard and they go find their commanders. Instead, they find a crowd of women with small children and chests of tea are falling over the side. This goes on for 15-20 minutes. 342 chests of tea fall overboard. Finally, some soldiers get through the bar and the group goes to save them. The crowd lets the natives know the British are coming. They take off their disguises and blend in with the crowd. The British are pretty sure that there are no natives, Americans, but no one is also ratting the people out. Spring of 1774, the British bring their punishment. Parliament passes a series of laws known as the Intolerable Acts. In April of 1775, things go from a theoretical revolution to a war. The problem with training and getting ready for the possibility of war. Spies from Britain knew this, though. Boston was good at battle plans and storing weapons. As the British get more reports that weapons are being stored and trainings are taking place, they set up their spies. A few Boston leaders leave for fear of being arrested. They go to the suburbs, and the British couldn't find them. As they look for Hancock and Adams and weapons and stuff, the colonists in Boston also have spies. They work in government offices and bring coffee to British military. People taking minutes at the meetings and British double agents. The colonists know when the British find out where everything is, they're going to come for them. In April, the British start developing intelligence. Lexington and Concord British are getting references about Lexington and Concord. They send 1,000 troops to get both of them at the same time. The colonists know that they just need to know when. On the 18th of April, one of the spies reports to Boston, Son of Liberty, that it's on the 19th. They send out 3 writers, Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott. They go into separate roads and going in separate directions and warn everybody before the British get there. Hancock and Adams are on Lexington and weapons are in Concord. Revere makes it to Lexington and the leaders are able to escape. As he goes to Concord, he is arrested by the British. Dawes got lost. Prescott heads to Concord first and warns them, and they move the weapons, and then he goes to Lexington. The British march out at first light and head to Lexington, and they find there's no leaders there. They figure their operation was gone, and shots were fired in Lexington. The British didn't want this to be a battle, but they got the upper hand in Lexington. 18 colonists are casualties. No British were harmed. They go to Concord, and there's no weapons. And Concord have their guns ready to fight, but the British just want to go home. They go back to Boston. On the way back, the Concord militia have stationed themselves and snipers ready. The British have 24 casualties, and colonists have no losses. This is where the beginning of the Revolutionary War begins, and Britain was more than ready for a war with many advantages. Now I will talk about the Boston Massacre. The Boston Massacre, not intentional. The commander of British troops was a poopy head. He made problems in Boston on purpose and was looking for an incident where he could throw someone in jail. Some colonists played into this. Captain Preston didn't want to be in Boston, so he took to marching through Boston twice a day. March 1770, this goes on for months. People start getting angry, they start yelling at them. The British don't send their best troops. Their troops are very young. They're getting moody very quickly. The officers are trying to keep the kids in line. The colonists start throwing things at the soldiers, from rocks to poo-poo. The soldiers don't like this. Days pass until March 5th. A soldier dives into the crowd and fistfights start. The fight grows to a large fight. The captain eventually orders the troops to fire. He says to fire in the air. Soldiers fired into the crowd. The crowd disperses and there are 5 dead or dying colonists. This is the first bloodshed. 5 years pass before anything started again. As the British were ready to bring troops back home, the leaders in Boston wanted to hold trials in Boston. They wanted justice. Reluctantly, Britain let the trials be held in Boston, and 12 of the 14 soldiers leave insolent. The Gaspee Affair. The British didn't want smuggling. They had ships looking for suspicious activity. The Gaspee is a British naval vessel. It was used for trainees. The British Navy was a bad place to work. It was strict, physical punishment, food is horrific. What British vessels did was liberate food from people on the shore. In the night you pulled in and send some people on shore and take some food from the other farms and stuff. This was especially for the Gaspee. When in 1772 it pulls in and sends them out, but it takes a bit longer than expected. The farmers were charging out with weapons, so the sailors had to hurry while keeping their steelies. Families gather at the shorelines. The sailors can't leave because their ship is now on low tide, so they set fire to the Gaspee. The next morning, what's left is sitting there. The sailors say the farmers need to be arrested for arson, and investigators went looking for evidence. But no one says anything. No one is arrested or punished. Basically, the British soldiers would dock, steal food from the farmers, and one day they just couldn't leave, so the farmers burnt down their ship. Yeah, that's it. So I already talked about the Tea Act of 1773, so I'll just summarize it a bit. It was basically, it lowered the tax on tea, but the BEIC, or the British East India Company, had a lot of tea on them. Or no, that's not it. They didn't have a lot of tea, and what they did have was really stinky. So they just kept importing tea into America, or the colonies, I guess. And eventually the colonies were just like, we don't have room for them. And so they were like, well, we're just going to sit here. And so some colonists dressed up as Native Americans, threw all their tea out, then ran away. And they never got caught. And that was also the Boston Tea Party. So, yeah. Now I will talk about the Intolerable Acts, also known as the Coercive Acts or whatever. So the first Intolerable Act was a law that closes the port of Boston permanently until the tea is paid for. The second law changes the government structure of the colony of Massachusetts, which is a royal colony now. The elected power no longer has power, the elected assembly no longer has power. The third law is the Quartering Act. Even if a town has barracks, a British commander can still put troops in your house if he wants to. The fourth law, any British official accused of a crime in the colonies won't be tried in the colonies. They will have to be taken home to England for trial. Every single colonist are paying for the acts of 150 colonists. Very bad stuff. I have also previously mentioned the First Continental Congress meeting in September 1774 in Philadelphia. So just to summarize, they came together and decided they were going to write a letter to the king saying, hey, all these acts you're passing kind of suck. Maybe you don't know about it. Please stop. Also, can we please return to solitary neglect so we can just, be chill and all. And they would come back together in the spring of 1775, so around half a year later, I believe. Also, by the time it becomes the second meeting, war happens, or it starts, I guess. The second meeting of the Continental Congress is May 5th, 1775 in Philadelphia. Georgia doesn't show up again. The Continental Congress becomes a government for a while. They need to prepare for war. They need an army, organization, and cities gonna send men. Colonies? One of the big debates was who's commanding the Continental Army, John Hancock or George Washington. A lot of favor for John Hancock, but he was in Massachusetts, and a lot is happening over there already. They decide on George Washington because they get support from Virginia. The next morning, they fully nominate George Washington and tell Adams to nominate. Each state puts forward money, troops, supplies. George Washington lives from 1732 to 99. They also start wondering how they should pay for the war. They ask other countries to help pay for the war. France, the Continental Congress choose Benjamin Franklin to go to France. He was a nudist. There was talk of cresting a new currency called continental dollars. They needed help from the outside, so they sent representatives to countries that hate England. There were three key countries: France, Spain, and the Netherlands. All three countries eventually provide assistance at some point during the war. French allies with America. They do another mission. They send another letter to the king, which was the same letter again, basically. The delegates are saying there's no coming back from fighting with the British outside the Continental Congress. A third of the population of the colonies didn't want to split from Britain. A third was indifferent. They all go home in June, and they don't come back together again until 1776. The two committees at the Continental Congress, one was for the Declaration of Independence, which took 2 weeks to write. The second committee for the Constitution took a year and a half to write. In June 1776 to November 1777 was what time passed to write the Constitution. It takes until February 1781 to get all the states to approve it. Then, in 1787, we needed it to go away. A debate over what the government started with it being a republic. National government, no king. Unicameral or bicameral. The unicameral legislature has one house, bicameral has two houses. We chose unicameral. When the document is finally presented, the Articles of Confederation, it was fairly short. It set up the national level government, which consists of a unicameral legislature and nothing else. Just a legislative branch. No leader, just Confederation Congress. Each state had a delegation. Send multiple representatives, one state, one vote. Doesn't matter what kind of state you are, you have the exact same representation as everybody else. To pass anything, it wasn't majority. You needed a vote of 9 of 13 to get anything done. You needed all 13 states to agree to change something in the Articles of Confederation. The balance of power was the national government had almost no power, and the states had all the power. It wasn't until the 9th edition that they said Congress was in charge of foreign affairs. The national government could declare war, could mediate boundaries disputes between the states, they could run the post office service, they could deal with Native Americans' territories living outside of the American borders. No taxation authority for the national government. They have to ask the states for money, and they could say no. National government doesn't regulate trade. Trade wars start. There's no national trade policy. Congress can't tax or raise an army. They send it to the states for approval for this form of government. Alright, next I'm going to summarize the battles of Lexington and Concord because I already talked about it earlier. So basically, the British are going to be like, we're going to come down and get the leaders of this revolution in Lexington on the 19th of April. And some people from Boston were like, nuh-uh. Those people were Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott. They all go in. Paul Revere goes to Lexington and says, guys, get out of there. And so Hancock and Adams leave, and the weapons are in Concord. But William Dawes, gets lost, so he doesn't matter. Samuel Prescott goes to Concord, and they're like, guys, they're coming, so they go and hide the weapons. On the 19th, the British march out at the first light and go to Lexington, but there's no one there. So they figure the operation was gone. There were shots fired in Lexington, but, I mean, that's kind of all we know. No one was harmed, although 18 colonists are casualized. Concord, no weapons, and they don't want to fight, so they just try to leave. But on their way out, the Concord militia have stationed themselves, and they kill 24. They have 24 casualties on the British side, none on the colonist side. And this is like the first battle, I guess. Now I'm going to be talking about the book Common Sense as well as a freaking fuck ton of other stuff, alright? So January 1776, short book called Common Sense is released. The author is Thomas Paine, who lived from 1737 to 1809. He's not a founding father. He is unremarkable until his book comes out. He is an Englishman who owned a failed small business and lost almost everything. He goes to the colonies in 1774 to start over. He gets a loan and rebuilds a business and owns a home in Boston. As he moves to the colonies and sees what's happening, he writes Common Sense as a wake-up call about his experience from England to colonies, describing how good the colonies have it. He says that they have something very different and better than England society. He says that the colonies are better and shouldn't try to stay with England. He says don't try to get back in with England because of the abuse they received from them. He says to be independent and break away. He talks about a new social, political, economic structures. This moves the people on the fence. The copies swarm from the colonies and over 100,000 copies are published. Most people couldn't read or write, so they organized readings where people read the book for those who cannot read and write. When the Congress come back together and there's no reply from the king, fighting has continued with sporadic battles. The colonies are moving towards war. Early June, Congress sets up 2 committees. One is to draw a document and create a government and write a constitution. The second is going to write a statement of independence, why they are doing it and why they have the right to do it. This committee has 5 members: Thomas Jefferson from Virginia, the writer, Ben Franklin from Pennsylvania, the editor, John Adams from Massachusetts, the votes guy, Robert Sherman from Connecticut, and Livingston from New York. Jefferson didn't want to write it. They picked him because he was from Virginia. He was the youngest. He said that John was a better writer than him, but people liked Jefferson more for some reason. The declaration he writes was like a legal brief. 4 parts of the declaration. Part 1 is the introduction of why they are rebelling. Part 2 is the theoretical support of why they have the right to be independent. Big parts of the Declaration was plagiarized. He pulls ideas from a bunch of places. Pulls from the Constitution of Virginia, Thomas Paine, and John Locke's, who by the way lived from 1632 to 1704, book. Locke wrote a book in 1690, and Jefferson used his ideas a lot. He takes 2 primary ideas. The first is government is a necessary thing. The people form the government and choose to have a government and is responsible to the people. When we create government, we have to give up some of our freedom, but the government must respect the rest of the freedom. Man has 3 inalienable rights: the right to life, to liberty, and the pursuit of property. Jefferson writes this in the original draft. When Ben Franklin got the draft, says it sounds like we're in it for material gain. He doesn't want it, and he wants the property to come out. Franklin came up with happiness instead of property. The other thing is due to the fact we set up the government. Contract between the governed and the government. Social contract theory. If the government oversteps, they have broken the contract, then you can walk away and get a new government. Part 3 of the Independence is a list. The list of crimes of England. Something Jefferson did is he didn't say Parliament, he said the king did it all. He says he tried to reach out for help, and he never responds. Part 4 is a summary of everything. Why they have the right, and the crimes of the king and the colonies. Says that they are doing it because they must, not because they want to. Jefferson finishes this in the end of June, and it goes to Congress. Franklin got it first and cut it back. I don't know who Franklin is. Congress makes 33 more changes. Franklin. Gotcha. Franklin got it first and cut it back. Congress makes 33 more changes. One was introduction to slavery was taken out. On the 2nd of July, they vote on it. The vote isn't completely unanimous. They approve the declaration, and they should sign it. They send it out to be prettied, and they don't get it back until August when they sign it. John Hancock signed it first in his big old letters. Alright, now I'm going to talk about the Declaration of Independence. A lot of it I already said already, so I'm going to summarize everything I already said first, and then I will talk about what I haven't talked about. So, the Continental Committee met up, and they basically were just like, we're going to make 2 committees. One of them was to write the Declaration of Independence. Ben Franklin was the editor. Thomas Jefferson was the writer. John Adams was the guy who got the votes. Then there was also Robert Sherman and Livingston. Jefferson didn't want to write it, but he was forced to. Took 2 weeks. He had it. He plagiarized a lot from John Locke's book. Part 1 of the Constitution was basically a legal brief that said why they were allowed to do what they were doing, which is fair. Part 2, or what he wrote in the second one, part 2 is theoretical support of why they get to be independent. Part 3 is a list of crimes the king did, even though it was really parliament, but whatever. And then part 4 is just a big ol' wrap everything up, which is fair, I guess. Alright, now for the stuff I haven't said yet. We wrote the Declaration of Independence, right? We were doing this for more than one reason, though. This was meant as a propaganda document. It was aimed at an international audience, presenting our side of the story on high moral ground, ignored the positive things England did for the colonies, highlighted the worst things Britain had done, ignored what the colonies have done. The second goal is to gain support. We didn't aim it at England. It was for everybody to see. France, Prussia, Spain, Netherlands. We know we aren't going to win by ourselves. Internally, it helped promote unity within the colonies. It was meant to have everyone read it and relate at it, some degree. It builds a sense of not just me, but us. We are trying to convey a sense of confidence. They have rights, God on their side. The colonies don't win this war, nor do they lose. Britain gives up. They decided it wasn't worth it. War is costing Britain more money, which is counterproductive. England could have won the war. The colonists did have a few advantages. They are fighting at home and know the terrain and geography. They are fighting for their homes and families and stuff. The colonists are more committed to the war. We do get assistance from other European countries, mainly France. France was the second most powerful nation on the earth, and in some ways better than England. They gave cash, credit, supplies, troops, and it pushes France to the verge of bankruptcy. Later, they have a revolution in France. Will probably be brought up later. France helps the colonists because it'll hurt England. They don't want to jump in full force on the colonist side if they don't think they can win. The French sends assistance as early as 1777. They send small shipments of money and weapons. They are doing it quietly. If they do well with this, they would join the war on their side. We did make good use of their supplies. We used them for a major battle. October of 1777, the colonists win one of the major battles. Saratoga, upstate New York. First real battle the colonists won with French supplies. We had a guy in France named Ben Franklin to talk to the French into helping us. He lived in 1706 to 1790. He is 70 when he is sent over. He goes over at the end of 1776 to talk to the French. The people he meets say there's no possible way he's from the colonies, because they aren't smart, or well-dressed, or well-educated, so no one talks to him. So he sends a letter to his wife and asks her to send his gardening clothes. The next party he goes to, everybody will talk to him. He's smarter than a lot of people he is negotiating with. He's also good at parties. He was a ladies' man. He slept around a lot. He also likes to salute the sun naked. People in Paris come to understand this will happen every day. He only tended to get fully clothed if he was leaving. He often ordered room service a lot. He gets in meetings with people in the government where he can ask for more support and supplies. When the British found out that they were beaten in Saratoga, they sobered up. I lost my spot. They sobered up and decided to try to end this war. Ben Franklin gets a message from Britain, and it says they would like to end the war. And it has a proposition that they will end the war in return to salutary neglect and allow a couple seats in Parliament and no hanging to any participated, and they would only ask if they remain their colonies. Carlisle Peace Plan, November of 1777. 2 years ago, people would have gone for it, but Franklin decides that it was too late. He shares it with the French and says maybe we don't need you guys anymore because the war will end soon. He knows the colonists won't accept it, but the French don't. In February 1778, a treaty is signed between the United States and France. Treaty of Alliance. The French join the war openly and declare war on England to help the United States, and they say they will fight until they gain their independence. The second thing was French had no interest that they would regain their territory. Only changes were between the U.S. and England. Finally, both the U.S. and France agreed that neither of them would make a separate peace treaty with England. They would negotiate peace together. We get full backing, and France declares war on England and joins the war. There was also a trade treaty so they can trade with France. The France spend more money on the revolution than we do. They give us over $8 million in 5 years. They also talked to the Spanish into giving us $4 million of equipment. The French give us weapons and soldiers carrying weapons. Over 12,000 French soldiers in North America. They sent naval vessels. Battle of Yorktown in October 1781. A large British army blocked the land of the peninsula, and the French blocked the egress and any other escape route. The French assistance doesn't win the war. The colonists win small battles and some large battles, but they are not winning the war. The victory at Yorktown reaches England, and the British government falls, and a new one comes in and says this isn't worth it to fight. In 1782, a couple Englishmen show up in Paris and go to Ben Franklin's hotel, and they say they want to negotiate a peace treaty. He sends a letter to New York and tells them about this. He gets a letter back saying yes. He gets 2 more Americans to help him negotiate. He is joined by John Adams and John Jay. They come with a limit, a reminder to Ben to let the French know about the negotiations. Across spring and summer, they negotiate with the British during the day, and at night they talk to the French. The French want to drag this out and bleed the British to weaken them. The Americans know what they are doing, but they are tied to the treaty. After a few months, John Jay stays behind from the French meeting, and he goes to a bar where a British dude is there. John Jay says he hates the French because they suck. He says they acknowledge the treaty, but asks if he would be willing to meet with him separately about peace treaties. He says fine. In some more months, John Jay and the British have a second set of peace treaties. At the end of the summer, John Jay says he was meeting with the British and he has negotiated a peace treaty that gives them everything we want. And the Americans say, nuh-uh, but he shows them the peace treaty and they don't want to break the treaty with the French, and the peace treaty is awesome. Now I will talk about the Treaty of Paris. John Adams and Benjamin read the treaty, and it was very favorable to the United States. Britain wanted out because it was costing money and resources. They send the treaty to New York and tell everybody that explained why there is this treaty, and they read the treaty, and they liked it. They signed the preliminary treaty in 1782, and it will be approved in September 1783. This is the Treaty of Paris. The treaty states that Britain fully recognizes that the U.S. is no longer a part of the British Empire and is independent. 2. It will set the boundaries of the U.S. western border is the Mississippi River is now the U.S., which is what was given to Britain after the 7 Years' War. The southern is all the way down to Florida. Florida belongs to Spain again. Britain keeps Canada on the 49th parallel. Our northern border is the 49th parallel around the Great Lakes. 3rd, the British made us promise to stop jailing people who didn't support the revolution or loyalists. 4th, we would make people pay back their debts to the British. This treaty was really good. The British were hoping that this would put a dent between the US and France. We didn't lose the war because England was really far away. It takes a long time to get from one place to another. It made new men and resources inconsistent. British also didn't bring their best armies to the war. They sent teenage troops to fight with their not strongest weapons. The British morale, troops didn't feel like a lot of support from home and aren't enthusiastic for this war. For the British, there wasn't a huge reason to fight the US. It was kind of like a civil war to them in some ways. There was also 2 different styles of war. The British fought in technical troops and battles. The Americans fought by ambushes and hiding and guerrilla warfare. The colonists fought harder than the British because they were fighting for their homes. The British soldiers didn't have the same emotional investment. They were also assisted from the French in other countries. It allows us to hold on enough before the British give up. Now, the United States is a real country. By the way, in the Treaty of Paris, you might remember that the British promises to pull out of certain Northwest territories, and by 1784 they still had it, and they were still hanging around the United States because they were figuring, they're gonna fail, so we'll just swoop back in and take everything. That doesn't happen, but that's why they are there for so long, until 1784. Now I'm going to talk about the Articles of Confederation. I have already talked about it a little bit, so we'll summarize as I go. Starting with the Articles of Confederation starts in February of 1781. And it is a unicameral, which means one house government, and that is just legislation. There is no leader, it's just Confederation Congress. Each state had a delegation They send multiple representatives. There was one state, one vote. Doesn't matter how big your state is or how populated it is. Same exact representation as everyone else. To pass anything, it wasn't a majority vote. It was a 9 out of 13 votes. You needed all 13 states to agree to change something in the Articles of Confederation. The balance of power for the national government was the national government basically got nothing, and the states had all the power. It wasn't until the 9th edition to the Articles of Confederation that the Congress was put in charge of foreign affairs. What the national government could do was declare war, mediate boundary disputes between the states. They could run the post office service. They could deal with the Native American territories that live outside the American borders. They couldn't tax. They had to ask states for money, and the states could say no to that. They also didn't regulate trades, which caused trade wars, and there was no national trade policy. Congress couldn't tax or raise an army, and states like this for some reason. The Articles of Confederation was a very weak form of government where the state government had more power than the national government. The national government cannot tax. They need unanimous approval in the states in 1777. It takes over 3 years for all states to approve. March of 1781. Some states were granted sea-to-sea grants. 7 of the 13 colonies had these grants. They were also able to have a lot of land and make a lot of money, but half of the colonies were not in the same boat. They didn't have a bunch of land out west and resented the states that did. During the war, these colonies refused the Confederation until the states that did have western land gave them up. They wanted it to give it to the national government. In late fall of 1780, all the states finally gave up their claims but promised to give it to the national government. The Articles of Confederation go into effect in March of 1781, with all the colonies finally signing. No central government, no executive, no courts, just legislature. Not a lot can get done because of the voting process. This is what the states wanted because they hated the British government. Some things do get accomplished. It's the government that finished off the war, technically. 2 laws were passed after they got the land out west that were important to developing the land. Land Ordinance 1785 sets public land policy. This law states how to organize and sell the land out west. They divided the western land into squares of 640 acres. Since they sell 36 of these squares, they can incorporate a town. You can go buy land personally, west. You buy a section, which was the whole thing, or half a section, or a quarter section. Most people buy a quarter section because it was expensive. The price as decided by the land ordination. It was $1 an acre, which was a lot back then. Most people didn't have cash, they grew everything they needed, and it made their own clothes. This way of selling land leads to orderly development. These processes and procedures, it also finally provides income for the national government. Every acre of land sold goes to the national government where they can run posts, make armies, and pay ambassadors. But what if a town wants to be states? There's no written way to be states. Northwest Ordinance 1787, the Confederation Conference passes this. It sets a policy to set new states, which was based on population. Once there were several towns in a given area, 20 to 30,000 people, you can ask Congress to become a territory. Congress votes, and if they say yes, then they can appeal a territorial governor. Then they wait for the population to grow. Once the population reaches about 60,000, they can apply for statehood. They vote again. Were they going to be equal than other states? Yes, they would be equal. The Northwest was Ohio, Michigan, Iowa, stuff like that. This territory was not plantation-style agriculture land. The things that grow are cereal grain. The farms were going to be more family-style farms. Any states coming out of the Northwestern Territory, there will be no slavery. Southern states needed to sign off on this, which some do. This sets a precedence that the national government does have the right to regulate slavery. Slavery wouldn't have worked in this area. The person who wrote this Northwest Ordinance was Thomas Jefferson, who was a slave owner and had an issue with slavery. Very ironic. The Articles of Confederation was a failure on all affairs. Foreign policy didn't work well. One of the British promised to do a Treaty of Paris was to pull out of the Northwest Territory. By 1784, they still had it. The British were hanging out until the United States failed so they can get back their colonists. The national government couldn't do anything because they had no funding or money. Farmers wanted to ship their crops up and down the Mississippi River, but they couldn't get out because Spain still controlled New Orleans. Spain also thought the American government was going to fail. The Spanish tried to get people to join Spain, and some farmers were considering it because it worked better for farming and trade. We couldn't make Spain stop because we didn't have the power. By the time the war ends, the U.S. economy slows down. In the mid-1780s, the U.S. economy declines. People lose jobs. Markets started changing. More workers than jobs. It wasn't terrible, but thousands were out of work and hundreds of businesses must go out of business. Farmers do well in the war because they sell their crops to the army. Farmers take the money to build more and produce more. After the war, the farmers are in debt and wages go down, and then more competition grows. There's more supply than demand. Prices for farm stuff goes down a lot and they can't cover the debt. The bank takes things back and repossesses. Now there's no income at all. In 1787, there's a thing called Shays' Rebellion, which if I talk about it now, I don't need to later, so I'm going to do it right now. In Shays' Rebellion, there were like 1,500 men who were veterans from the war. They want to go to the State House because they want the government to fix this recession. Instead, the government calls out the local militia. There are battles. Many are injured, many arrested, and the actual rebellion goes down really easily, and the threat that this seems to pose is a big one. What if more rebellions happen? The national government doesn't have the power to fight back. For the political elites, this is a threat to them. With policy issues and the Spanish tinkering with treason in the Southwest, the members of the Article of Confederation decides to make some changes. They pass an agreement to hold a meeting to amend the Articles of Confederation. They chose Philadelphia, and they asked all 13 states to send representatives to amend the Articles of Confederation. In May to September of 1787, Congress of the Constitution. The founding fathers of the Revolution come together except Thomas Jefferson, plus some younger people were there. 55 people showed up. Well-educated and experienced politicians and businessmen. Rich and overeducated. They will try to fix the system. The first thing they do is elect George Washington to be in charge. They also call roll. Make sure everyone is there. Rhode Island was not there by choice because they didn't want to amend the Articles of Confederation. They assumed they would just go home and not do anything, which didn't happen. The Constitution was illegal. Everybody wanted to continue without Rhode Island. The next thing they do is shut down this meeting to the media. They don't want daily reports. No reporters are welcome. There's no formal transcript. They board up the windows. There's no formal records. The last thing they decide was the voting structure. They were going to keep the one state to vote thingy. Yeah. But it wasn't based off the major majority. They only needed 17 out of 13 votes for something to be passed, which just means one vote more than tied. They now needed to decide on what they wanted. They wanted a stronger national government, but how much more power? They also needed to implement checks and balances, or separation of powers, if they wanted a stronger national government. This weakens each branch of government. Everybody has a specific set of things that they can do. They want the people to have a say in the government, but they are not looking to create democracy. Back then, it was a sucky thing to have. How much power should the people have? Once they have a general sense of what they need to work out the details, but there's one more problem. They don't have absolute agreement on what those things mean. And also, they haven't amended the Articles of Confederation yet. They set up two committees. One is going to write something entirely new. The other one's going to amend the Articles of Confederation. They'll bring both plans forward, and they will try to decide on what they want. Alright, I'm going to remind you about the Northwest Ordinance. It was released in 1787 that the Confederation passed during the Articles of Confederation, and it was a new policy on states which was based on population, of setting up new states. There were several towns in a given area of 20 to 30,000 people. You can ask Congress to become a territory. Congress votes, and if they say yes, they will appeal a governor. Then they wait for population to grow. Once it's 60,000 people, they can apply for statehood, and then they vote again, where they would be treated as equal states if they were gonna be states. And that was how we got stuff like Ohio, Michigan, Iowa, cool stuff like that. Not plantation-style farms, family farms, no slavery. I will also remind you of Shays' Rebellion. 1,500 veterans from the war march into Boston spring of 1787. They want to go to the State House to make the government fix the recession. The government calls out the militia. There are battles. Many are injured, arrested, and the rebellion goes down easily, but it is what causes the government to realize maybe the Articles of Confederation are kind of stinky poopy butthole. Alright, back to the articles and stuff. So there were two plans that were made. One of them was called the Virginia Plan, where they wrote something completely new. This increases the size of the national government, gives them a lot more power, creates our branches of government, and gets rid of one state, one vote. It's actually proportional representation, more power based on how many people you have in your state. The first branch of government is legislature bicameral. There will be two houses, a lower house and an upper house. The lower house is directly elected by the people with proportional seats. Bigger houses get more seats. Bigger states get more seats. 65 seats and divide the population by 65 decides how many seats per state. The upper house will be chosen by the lower house. With no guarantee, smaller states would have a seat in this house. The second branch of the government is the executive branch of one person chosen by the legislature. The third branch is the judiciary branch to enforce laws, wasn't fully fleshed out at the time. Fourth house is the Council of Revision. The executive and some of the judges would review the constitutionality of laws passed by the judicial branch. They pass judgment on every law passed by the legislature, basically if the law is okay to pass. There was also a plan called the New Jersey Plan, but that's not in my notes of things to talk about, so screw it, I guess. George Washington on the 2nd of July says to bring one guy from each state and to go into the attic and to not come out until there was a compromise, because they didn't like either plans and neither states could agree on any of the plans. In Philadelphia, during this time it was hot, and they come to a compromise on the 16th. This is known as the Connecticut Plan. On the 2nd of July in 1787, the 12 delegates from he tells 12 delegations to send one guy. They go in the attic, and on the 16th of July, the Connecticut Plan, or the Great Compromise, was born. What took so much time was the representation of states. This plan was three branches of government. The first was legislature, which was bicameral, so two houses again, House of Representatives and the Senate. House of Representatives will have proportional representation of at least one representative. To determine how to divide the seats every 10 years, they count the population of each state. If a state has grown enough, they might have more seats, and vice versa. There was only 69 seats at the times. There were direct elections. People voted for the House of Representatives. The states were allowed to decide who can and cannot vote, but they couldn't change the election date. Terms were 2 years. Have to be 25 to be part of the House of Representatives. The Senate, equal, two representatives from all the states. Senators are not elected. They are appointed by the state legislators. Terms were 6 years. Neither house has term limits, meaning you can continue to re-elect forever. Must be 30 years to be the House of Representatives. Executive branch of one person with a specific list of powers. This person is chosen by the Electoral College. Each state has a certain number of votes based on congressmen and senators, with a bare minimum of 3. The state legislature would choose 12 people and cast the state's electoral votes. The president didn't have a term limit. They had terms of 4 years and needed to be 35 to be president. The president has specific duties that are absolute powers. Foreign trade, military, but cannot declare war. Judicial branch, national court system, Supreme Court. Supreme Court is nominated by the president, but approved by the Senate. Supreme Court is final say in passing laws. Obviously, there will be changes and additions from the delegates with this plan as they proportion out representatives. They ask who is supposed to count as the population. The South wants slaves to count as population, so they have more representatives. The South would gain more power in the government if the slaves counted as population. The North says fine, but then they will add slaves to your taxes. They made another compromise, the 3/5 compromise, which basically is just a stupid thing. Now I'm going to be talking about something called the Judiciary Act of 1789. So Congress comes into session in April of 1789, and there are 4 major actions. I don't need to talk about all of them. I just need to talk about the Judiciary Act, so whatever. The Judiciary Act of 1789 deals with courts, and the only court that is required is the Supreme Court. But Congress can establish other courts, so they expand the court system, which has 3 layers. The bottom layer is the district courts. You break the federal law, you go to district court. There were 13 districts, basic trial. Either side can appeal to the Federal Court of Appeals. The Court of Appeals does not hear evidence. All they do is look at the transcripts of the case and make sure the judge didn't screw it up. They don't rule as an individual judge. There are 3. Majority rules over whether the court was right, or they reverse the decision. They end up being retried. Whoever loses at the appeal court can appeal to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has a jurisdiction over everything. Any case can go to the Supreme Court from either district or state courts. However, the Supreme Court doesn't have to hear your appeal. If they refuse to appeal, then your verdict from last trial remains final. The ultimately thing the Supreme Court is supposed to do is to decide the constitutionality of laws. This is called a judicial review. This is the primary job of the Supreme Court. If the court says it isn't constitutional, they can strike it down, either all of it or part of it. State law breaks our state courts. Congress makes good on a promise for the 4th thing. That's something else. We don't need to talk about that. No. Now I'm going to talk about the Bill of Rights. I'm not going to remember anything from this. I'm going to have to review this like 20 times over, so, whatever. Anyway, right, so this is the 4th thing that I was mentioning earlier, is that anti-federalists, because there was a party called the Anti-Federalists and the other one was Federalists, but the Anti-Federalists were very mad that there were no rights guaranteed in the Constitution. Hamilton, or Alexander Hamilton, and some others say that they can't add rights to the Constitution because it's a blueprint of the government. But Congress will write a Bill of Rights. They ask the states for possible amendments to add rights to the Constitution. They get like 40 and sort through them and either throw away repeats, combine a few, and throw away some. They finalize with 12 amendments and they go out to the 13 states, and 3/4 of the state need to approve it. 10 pass, but 2 are shot down. This becomes the Bill of Rights. The first session of Congress ends and everything is put to work. Yada yada, yada yada. Alright, now I'm going to talk about the differences between a Federalist and a Democratic Republican, or Anti-Federalist, or just Republican, according to this thing that I have. So, a Federalist believed in rule by the upper class. They also believed in a strong national government. They supported the government supporting the economy, the government promotion of domestic business, the government control over the economy. Foreign policy favored based off of England's foreign policy. They wanted to expand their bureaucracy. They wanted to limit the freedom of speech and press for a little bit of time just to get the government going. They didn't want backlash from the people. And they liked a loose interpretation of the Constitution. Now, the Republicans wanted more power from the people. They think the Constitution went too far, and they were more supportive of states' rights. The government supported of economic growth and business, but small farms should be a priority. No special favors are held from the government for the business. No national debts, no tariffs. They like France. They like the way France does things. The foreign policy they like is also based off of France's. They want a smaller bureaucracy. They don't want any limits of speech or press. And they have a strict interpretation of the Constitution rather than loose. Alright, I'm going to talk about a guy named Alexander Hamilton. Yes, it's the one from the play. No, I haven't seen it. Never will. Fuck you. In 1755, he was born. He dies in 1804. Alexander Hamilton is different from many other people. Most of the founding fathers are old school, come from money and influence, and ancestors came to the U.S. 50 to 100 years before. Not Hamilton. They wrote the Constitution so that Hamilton couldn't be president. Not a wealthy background. Parents weren't married at birth. Came out of New York for opportunities. No money for a good education or house. He went to school off scholarships to the King's College, or also known as Columbia College. Eventually, he got a legal degree and becomes a lawyer. He is younger than most of the founders. When he graduates, he decides to go into the military during the war. He becomes the treasurer of the government, which is cool at some point. I don't remember when. He isn't a good soldier, but is good with organization and quickly rises in the ranks. He catches the eye of the commander of the Continental Forces because Washington was having issues with the organization. Hamilton gets promoted and becomes colonel at 25. He goes on to organize the Continental Army, and Washington and Hamilton get really close, almost like a father and son relationship. After the war, he establishes his legal practice and becomes rich through his own effort. Everyone looked down on him because he had to work for his money, rather than people who inherited their wealth. Hamilton shows off his wealth and he doesn't really work. He doesn't have a lot of friends. When George becomes president, he has Hamilton set up their economy. Hamilton starts creating the U.S. economy, making America rich and powerful. England was in the early days of Industrial Revolution, and Hamilton understands the industry is the future. He knows agriculture is good, but they also need industry. He puts forward 3 separate economic reports. Which, before I talk about the reports, I just need to tell you that he was also a heavy Federalist and wants to keep Federalists in power, and he does a lot of weird illegal shit to do that. So, keep that in mind. Alright, reports. The first report on public credit that Hamilton did was in spring of 1790. It was a funding assumption. Hamilton is dealing with debt. There was a debt with the Revolutionary War and getting the government started. The debt was $50 million of national debt. How do they pay the debt? $30 million in state debt. Most of the 13 states had debt, which amounted to $30 million. If the states can't pay back those debts, are the people they owe going to take property and stuff? Hamilton wants the government to take the state debt and move it to the national debt, abolishing all state debt. This is to prevent foreign entities from taking land and ports. He also does this so that the states own the national government and will have the states tied closer to the government. Hamilton doesn't think we will pay this debt. He wants 2 new taxes dedicated to only paying off the national debt: a tariff and a whiskey tax. Whiskey tax was on alcohol. It wasn't specifically whiskey, it was just all in all alcohol. He liked this idea because it meant people weren't forced to pay it. It was just if you drank alcohol, you had to pay the tax. The problem is he can only propose his idea. He cannot put it into effect. There was a Federalist majority. Hamilton wanted some support from the DRs, the Republicans. He goes to Thomas Jefferson and asks for votes. Hamilton is willing to compromise by passing a bill if he wants it. A bill Thomas wants if everything Hamilton wants gets votes. There was an idea about a national city where the government will be its own district, so no city or state benefits from it. Jefferson wants the city in Virginia, and Hamilton agrees, and the first report is passed in 1791. The second report on credit. The first bank of the U.S. It's modeled off the Bank of England, provides a safe place for government money, provides affordable banking, and a bank with a lot of money for loans. It's a private public bank. Only 20% of the bank is controlled by the national government. The rest has funding from private investors, basically sell millions of dollars off bonds. The bank is also going to be used for the it's just going to be used for the public. Hamilton needed to put a time limit on the bank, chartered for 20 years. Hamilton expected that the bank comes up. When the bank comes up, people thought the Federalists would still be in power and would still be alive. He dies. Democratic Republicans are in power, and they hate the bank. They think it's unconstitutional, but the other side thinks it's fine, and it isn't forbidden in the Constitution. Both sides are right. It doesn't say you can or cannot build this bank. James Madison joins the Republicans. Hamilton went to George Washington and asked for his backing. It took a while because he wasn't sure either. Washington finally agrees, bank is chartered, and becomes into being in 1791 to 1811. A charter is like a list of guidelines of what a bank is going to do. It was popular and successful, fully funded on the first day. It doesn't do much for small businesses, however. This restores faith in the economy, lowers interest rates, it's useful. Hamilton gets what he wants, but not everyone is happy with this report. Now we're going to talk about the whiskey revolution that came out of the whiskey tax. So this was mostly small farmers, and there was a revolution based on the whiskey tax that was passed in 1791. Hamilton thought this was fairer than the tariff. The rebellion take place in western Pennsylvania, far away from major shipping hubs. Many grain farmers, expensive to move their grain. Something you can do with grain is turn it into alcohol. Distill grain is less cumbersome to ship and transport. A lot of farmers started doing that, and it turned a lot of it into liquor. They wanted to sell it. Whiskey tax says it needs to be taxed. Cuts into profit, people start to lose their farms. These farmers band together and attack tax collectors, march on county courthouses to stop the auctions, which are auctioning away their property and valuables and such and such. The state of Pennsylvania reaches out to the national government and says they need troops and an army. Many people saw the farmers' actions as treason. George and Hamilton donned uniforms and head an army into Pennsylvania. This was illegal for George Washington, but they didn't care. Nearly 15,000 men were in this army, less than 1,000 rebels. A couple dozen people were arrested. They most ran away. 2 were convicted of treason, although Washington gives them pardons. The 1794 is the rebellion. The Republicans don't particularly care about any of this, which is weird. Now I'm going to talk about Jay's Treaty. So from 1788 to 99, there was a French Revolution, and basically the government was being flipped on its head. A bunch of people were dying. Civil War. Other states like basically British state was also at war with France. Big old bloodbath. At some point, America was like, uh-oh, we're in a treaty with France. Are they going to make us help them? Because we're not very good at that. And basically, they asked Thomas Jefferson, and he was like, if they don't say anything, don't do anything. And they were like, okay. But what they were doing is they were still trading with France. But at some point, they were also trading with Britain. No, they weren't. I lied. But British was seizing their ships, which they were like, that's sucky. So, yeah. Also, back to a long time ago with their treaty of Paris with Britain, was that they still haven't retreated from the forts in the second treaty in 1783. Yeah. The British had promised to consider to force British citizens to pay back with runaway slaves. America decides to send someone to England in 1794. His name was John Jay. They want a treaty with England so they can get what they want peacefully. They sent him off late spring in 1794 with a list. However, they did not send anything. They didn't have anything the British wanted. Jay goes to England and they laugh at him. So Jay ends up negotiating something called Jay's Treaty. It's signed in November in 1794. Not much in the treaty was on the list of demands, but we do get the British promise. But we do get the British promised to leave the forts by June of 1796. The other thing that the British allowed, limited trade in our colonies and the Caribbean only. Third, seizing ships. They set up a commission to handle complaints. If the British seized a ship, you can file a complaint, and the commission would evaluate the seizure and decide whether it's right or not. If it was illegal, then they would suggest compensation for the British government. Second commission looks into debts owed by colonists from English citizens. English would file a complaint, and commission would review and decide whether they needed American citizens to pay them back. Not what John Jay was supposed to do. The treaty doesn't go into effect until the Senate will pass it. When Congress sees the treaty, they need Republican votes to pass it. The Republics hate this treaty and John Jay and the English. Even George Washington was appalled. The Senate didn't want to pass this treaty. It hangs in limbo throughout 1795. Meanwhile, the rest of the world knows it's a treaty, but not what it is. Spain was getting scared. Even though they were sided with England, the Spanish want out of the war. They were also part of this French and British war and Civil War, whatever. But they're afraid that Britain will come after them for leaving the war, which is fair. And they don't know what the treaty that America had with them is, but they think it might be an alliance. They don't want to be in war with England for pulling out of the war, and then America fighting them. So Spain asks the U.S. to send someone so that they can make a treaty. They send Thomas Pinckney, U.S. Ambassador of England. We chose him because we wanted to intimidate the Spanish, because he can figure out what the Spanish fear from the treaty. This treaty is signed in October in 1795, while the other treaty is still in limbo. This treaty is very important for Federalist foreign policy. It's so strong that they passed both the treaties at the same time. Pinckney's treaty, which is also important, remember that, Pinckney's treaty, says that they will formally set the border between the U.S. and Florida, boundary at the 31st parallel. It matters because it's further south than the Spanish originally claimed. We also get trade treaty, access to all Spanish colonies. We also have the right to navigate the Mississippi River freely, including New Orleans, which was a problem before. Finally, the right of deposit in the city of New Orleans. New Orleans is a foreign country, and America is allowed to rent warehouse space. We don't give up anything. Congress sees this and they love it, and they pass both the treaties at once in early 1796. Spain hates it and ends up pulling out of the war, and England gets angered, but we don't fight Spain because why would we? In 1796, it is presidential election year. George Washington has served 2 terms, and nothing was said that he couldn't serve more, but he was really tired and he doesn't really want to run for president again. He dies in 1799, so, that's good. But he writes a farewell address. He explains why he isn't running for a 3rd term. This was published in September 1796. Basically, it was his ideas written by Hamilton. It has 4 main parts. 1, it's George Washington saying he was a good president, because he's cocky like that. 2, he says whoever wins, please support them and unify behind them. Even if it's not the person you voted for, put the country first. 3, a warning against political parties. He says political parties make us more interested in our guy getting elected rather than the qualities of the candidates. Finally, the U.S. and foreign policy should avoid entangling alliances. He advises us to not sign long-term alliances. The flexibility is powerful. This introduces a concept called isolationism, that America needs to stay apart from the rest of the world. Federalists nominate John Adams and Thomas Pinckney for president and vice president, while the Republicans nominated Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. Now we're going to talk about something called the XYZ affair. So in 1797, the French now has a new government, but there's still war. And some of them thought about getting support from the U.S., but they decided instead to make America pay because, I don't know. The French people have interfered in the U.S. election of 1796. They were telling people to vote for specific people, and basically they were threatening war if Adams was president. Guess what? Adams is now president. 1798, John Adams calls in Jefferson and is like, hey, can you go talk to French about not being war? That'd be cool. And he says he just wants to send him to fail and look bad. And John was like, yeah, but also you're our best shot. And Thomas is like, freak you, bro. So instead, Adams sends these 3 guys called Elbridge Gerry, John Marshall, and Charles Pinckney. They are sent to Paris in spring of 1798. They arrive and send a letter to the government of France to discuss problems. Weeks pass, they get no response. They send a second letter. Still no response. They send a 3rd letter, and after a few days, there comes a knock on the door, and outside are 3 Frenchmen. These agents say that they are here to make an appointment for you. Arrange an appointment with a minister. They're going to arrange an appointment if they do 3 things, basically, is what I'm trying to say. The first thing they want is a formal apology from the U.S. to France for signing a treaty with England. The second thing is that France needs money from the U.S. without collateral, meaning if they aren't able to pay it back, then they don't have to pay back anything for replacement. And the third thing they want is the guys wanted $250,000 compensation, and usually there was fees with these meetings, but not this big of scale. So Americans say, yeah, we can't do any of those things, and we'll need to talk to the president about it. And the Frenchmen are like, all right, well, let us know when you're willing to do it. And so what happens is Gary stays in France while the other 2 return to New York and tell the president what is happening. Adams is like, yeah, we're not going to do any of that. And someone come get Gary and bring him back. And when the Americans all come home, everyone wants to know what happens. Adam told Congress what all happened, including letters they sent to the government and the responses and the names of agents. The Republicans are like, oh, okay, yeah, that's kind of sucky. And word gets out, and it'll make the Federalists look good for congressional election. Adams asks for money for military things. He also gets a piece of legislation, a collection of laws as Alien and Sedition Acts. Basically, it was a really bad deal. Yeah. Now I'm going to talk to you about some things called the Alien and Sedition Acts. So in late 1798, there were 4 laws that passed. 3 of them dealt with immigration. And these immigration laws were known as the Naturalization Acts, which refers to becoming an American citizen. And yeah. So basically, the first one was just increasing the amount of time it takes to be an American citizen. It used to just be you live and don't break any laws for 5 years. They basically just lengthened it from 5 years to 14 years. And once you do become a resident, or once you begin residency, you must register with the U.S. government so that they always know where you are. Second immigration law, the Alien Enemies Act. If you're a U.S. citizen, if you are a citizen of France, for example, and you're living in the U.S. and we go to war with France, you become an enemy alien. In wartime, the government may detain enemy aliens if they so choose. The third law is called the Alien Friends Act. It basically says the president can deport whoever he wants to if the president determines them to be a danger to national security. John Adams, who was the president at this time, never did this. The fourth piece of the Sedition Act outlaws conspiracies on the enforcement of federal law. This meant that if you are opposed to the Alien Acts or anything the federal law dictates, you've met the criteria to be locked up for 5 years. The second part of the law says you couldn't speak or print anything false, scandalous, or malice with the government or president, or else jail time. This act had a sunset limit, meaning it would only be in effect for like 4 years. 15 people will be detained, 10 will be convicted under the Sedition Act. When Jefferson comes into office, he will pardon everyone who was convicted and erase it off the record. People were so angry at France and what they did that they passed all these laws. But by 1800, nothing terrible came to pass. All right. The final thing we got to talk about is the 1800s election year, which was one of the most important elections in U.S. history. This is the first time that Federalists were not, in charge, and the Republicans will win the presidency and control Congress. So Thomas Jefferson won, first of all. This is the most screwed up election in history, though. The 12th Amendment gets passed in 1804, which changes the voting structure in the Electoral College, because that was the whole reason that it was so screwed up. Electors used to have 2 votes, now they only get 1, and they have to vote for a ticket. The Republican side is Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, and the Federalists are Adams and Pinckney, someone named C.C. Pinckney. Federalists make sure that the Hamilton thing that he did last time, I won't explain what it is, but it's just a lot of bribing, doesn't do that again. All Federalist electors only cast 1 vote. Adam gets 65 votes and Pinckney gets 64 votes. However, Thomas Jefferson gets 73 votes and Aaron Burr also gets 73 votes. And the House of Representatives will discuss it, but now it's 1 state, 1 vote, majority wins. Aaron Burr should have said delegations don't vote for me, supposed to be vice president, because that's what he was running for. But instead he starts campaigning for presidency like an idiot, and Jefferson doesn't like it. Burr is from New York, which is also where Hamilton is from. And Hamilton doesn't like Burr. He likes Thomas Jefferson. So he was like, well, frick it, Burr, Jefferson's the guy. And so, over multiple votes, Jefferson wins, and the Republicans have won, and someone's like, we can't let this happen again. So the 14th Amendment gets passed, and things change when Thomas gets into power. That's the last thing I said. I probably won't listen to this again. And I don't know if I retained any information, but I did it, I guess.